Hello and welcome to Fast Politics on YouTube. Today, I am beyond thrilled to talk to Sam Seder. He is the host of the Majority Report, and we are going to dive into the many policies that could help Dems get back the support of working families. Welcome to Fast Politics, Sam Seder.
Thank you so much, Molly. It's a pleasure to be here.
The child tax credit is an obsession of mine for any number of reasons, but really because cutting child poverty seems like, call me a lib, but seems like a no-brainer, right? We live in this wealthy country. We have Elon Musk has billions of zillions of, has planes and rockets and whatever. Should children be hungry, right? And it did actually cut child poverty, and then it was allowed to expire.
There are two things that I am really befuddled by that Democrats don't talk about more, and frankly, to the point of like suspicion,
Right.
and that the media also fails in talking about. One is that we cut child poverty by 45% in a matter of months.
Yeah.
Like, we have been talking about how intractable poverty is
Right.
in this country for decades.
Yeah.
And over again, you hear conservatives argue the Great Society failed, or the war on poverty failed, et cetera, et cetera. And to a large extent, that's because there were so many hoops that we put into it. This was a very straightforward, it wasn't universal, but it was about as universal as you can get without it being universal. In other words,
Mhm.
there wasn't like a huge, it's very simple to do. We know how much people make every year because we have the IRS. It is done through the IRS. It's a payment that's delivered there. It was $300 per child, and it would change. It would diminish depending on what your income level was. I think it went up to a household worth $145,000, maybe a little bit off. We cut child poverty in 45%. The idea that this wasn't talked about by every single media outlet and every day and by
Right.
every Democratic politician. And part of it was because we trusted some of the Senate elders, frankly, and the president to negotiate or to figure out how to get Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema on board. They never pounded Republicans enough for being responsible for preventing this. We never hear it brought up again by anybody. I mean, what what is a more basic, fundamental, that supposed agreement on cutting child poverty? What is more? What theoretically does everybody agree upon more than that? I can't come up with it. What it would be? I mean, and yet the country will talk for months and hundreds of millions of dollars expended in having a conversation about protecting elementary school and high school girls' sports and protecting
Right.
the kids. But when we talk about cutting child poverty, the conversation evaporates. And then the other thing is this notion of tax cuts and how cutting taxes will create more revenue, which is the premise for every tax cut that we've ever heard from Republicans. This is all based on the Laffer curve, which came out of the Reagan era. Arthur Laffer, on the back of a napkin, drew a graph where the higher the taxes go, the less people are willing to work, and therefore revenues drop. We have a great experiment with that. It's called the state of Kansas. When Sam Brownback
Mhm.
was governor
Right.
in 2012, he came in, he did that. Within 2 years, the Republicans raised taxes because it destroyed their education system and revenue didn't come up. And we never hear those two fundamental sort of real life experiments. It's as if they've just vanished into the ether.
So you brought up a really interesting point here, which is why these popular things are not talked about. Child tax credit, even like chips and science, right? Manufacturing, growing the economy. I don't know if you know this, but we used to have a Goldilocks economy before we went into a trade war with our biggest allies for seemingly no reason, and China. So I wonder if you would explain to us a little bit about why you think these really popular policies don't get talked about by Senate elders, and also what you think the Democratic Party should look like, when it comes to I mean, clearly there are a lot of very old members of the Democratic Party, and I'm wondering what you think, sort of how that should go.
I think the messaging follows the policy. And I think, like, with the Harris campaign, for, and without getting into what I perceive was happening internally, you have Mark Cuban out there basically saying that she's not going to be attacking corporations. We're going to get rid of like some of the antitrust stuff. There was a lot of mixed messages. And I think part
Right.
of that was because there was also a mixed sentiment as to from a policy perspective.
Right. No
And
question. But if you look at the Biden, I want to follow up for a second. If you look at Biden administration, they did not have mixed feelings. They were very, Lena Khan and monopolies. And Lena Khan got everyone in business world furious.
furious.
But Biden never got any credit from voters for what he was trying to do.
My theory about that, to a large extent, is if you look at where the polls went south for him, it's attributed to the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I'm sorry, I will never in a million years believe that the American public is that engaged
They are not.
in that.
Yeah.
It happened when there was a stall in his agenda. You'll recall that in
Mhm.
2021, they passed the American Rescue Plan, $2 trillion worth of
Right.
spending. You know what the Republicans were talking about in the weeks following that? When that came out, if you turned on Fox News, if you turned on any Republican podcast, you know what they were talking about? Dr. Seuss. They were
Right.
talking about there were 3 Dr. Seuss books that were not public. They had no response to
Right.
it.
Right.
And,
Right.
and,
Right. Right.
and what Joe Biden should have done
Down on
was
Mulberry Street.
was
Continue. Yes.
he should have immediately, you'll remember, he waited a couple of months, then he allowed the Republicans to come in. He allowed them to gum up the works. That failed. Then he allowed
Right.
Sinema and Portman to come in. It gummed up the
Manchin.
works. No, it wasn't Manchin. Manchin during that time, you'll recall, it was Sinema and Portman came in to
Right.
pitch something, some bipartisan thing. And
Right.
that was that summer. Prior to that, those 2 things stalling and killing about 4 or 5 or 6 months and the momentum,
Right.
Manchin is caught on audio deep into that summer talking to
Yes.
donors, looking to raise
Yes.
money. Now, prior to that, Manchin was out there saying, I think it should be, Build Back Better should be $6 trillion. He was to the
Yeah.
left of Bernie on this.
Yeah.
And I am convinced that in stalling, Biden allowed the sort of the disease that Democrats have from that generation. It has to be bipartisan.
Right.
That voters care more about bipartisan than they actually care about material benefits.
And they absolutely don't ever care about that.
They
I mean,
do
if
not.
Trumpism
They
is
say
any,
they do, but they
yeah,
don't.
yeah, they don't.
And they care about getting things done. And
Yeah.
he stalled. It allowed Joe Manchin to build up to hear from donors and then to get resources. And then they pulled Cinnamon and then the whole thing sort of stalled for 2 years, and they barely
Right.
eked it out 2 years later
Yeah.
in separate bills.
Yeah.
And that's when his polling started to go down. And so I think like that was around. And then there were 2 other things. One is he was clearly too old, and he had
Mhm.
said, I'm going to be a bridge. And he didn't
Yeah.
function in that bridge. And then
Yeah.
the other thing is Gaza. I think,
Right.
the foreign policy, I don't know that if you look at the first order votes that were lost in Michigan and Pennsylvania, made that much of a difference. It made some difference. But what it
Right.
definitely did, and I know this for a fact, having conversations offline, it depressed the activist class. It depressed the activist class. These are the people who are supposed to be going out there and repeating and talking about and essentially hyping what this current administration was doing for people. I mean, I could feel it. I mean, I could,
Right.
because I
Yeah.
was I thought what they were doing in terms of labor and in terms of antitrust was huge. And I
Right.
don't, I don't know if I certainly hadn't seen it in my lifetime. And,
Yeah.
I'm almost 60. And I don't know if I'm going to see it again from a Democratic president. But
No.
the policy that they took towards Israel and Gaza inhibited the activist class because, if you're under the age of 40 and you're looking at your phone, you're seeing horrific images on a daily basis for a year at that point.
No,
And so
I
I think those two
agree.
things-
I agree. I was at that Democratic convention in Chicago. I don't know if you were there,
No.
but there was a feeling that they didn't have anyone talk about Gaza.
No, they
And
didn't get a feeling. They literally wouldn't let one of the most partisan
right.
Democrats I've ever really experienced, this woman from Georgia who's a state senator, and she had her what she wrote approved. I mean, forwarded. I think it was just
Right.
a huge
It was
tactical,
just
strategic
tactical.
mistake.
Yes, tactical error, and I would say even more than that, there was a feeling you would walk to the convention center and you'd walk past a lot of protesters. And I am used to walking past right wing protesters. I
Right.
don't feel good. I'm the granddaughter of a communist who was jailed in the House of Un-American Activities, Howard Fast. So I don't feel great crossing a picket line. I try not to ever do it. But I don't have a lot of experience crossing a left wing protest, right?
Yep.
So I'm used to crossing the people who are like, you're a murderer or whatever. But where I'm crossing a left wing protest, I thought, like, this is bad. Because if we look historically at Democratic elections, when we see that the left is not aligned with when you've lost the base, you can't win,
Yep.
basically.
I think that's true. And I don't think there's a one-to-one relationship with it being the base in terms of like the electoral
Right,
base, but it's the activist class.
right,
And you need to have that kind of energy on the ground, particularly when you're talking about the margins you're having. When Clinton lost to Trump, I think there was about 6 but fours. And if you had taken away any one of those but fours, she would have won.
yeah,
With Harris, I think there were probably 4 or 5 things that had to combine together
right.
that added up to her losing. And so I think that was one of them. I think it was a prominent one. I think Tim Walz was out there. I think he is, at the very least, going out and saying he understands that they messed up as a campaign. And frankly, I don't think it was he was in a position to do much about it.
Right.
I think he was being a soldier, but I think acknowledging those things. The economy was good under Biden, but the measure of a good economy, I think, is no longer satisfying to people because they have waited too long and it has slowly, the pressure on people has increased. You can say that the numbers are good, but if minimum wage hasn't been raised in 20 years, I don't know how long it takes for
Right.
that dynamic to catch up. Maybe if it hasn't been raised for 10 years, it's not so bad. But by the time you get 20 years out from that minimum raise, even if
So,
the economic measures are good, it compounds. And I think that's true with a lot of different elements of our economy. And so
right.
you have the ACA, you got more people signed up into it, but it's still incredibly expensive. And you have the fallout of all that foreclosure from
Right.
2008. There's a lot of things that catch up. Josh Marshall, years and years ago when the blogosphere started, he had this concept called technical debt. And he said, like, if you don't upgrade, this is early on in this world, but if you don't upgrade with each new upgrade of WordPress or whatever it was, the further you get along with that, it compounds and it becomes that much harder to come back. And I think that's what happened. I think we've hit that point in our economy where the slow dynamic of neoliberalism has compounded, and it's created structural problems where what used to look like a good economy and would filter to people no longer does because of these structural problems within the economy. You can't have this level of wealth disparity. And this is very academic.
It's clearly what's happening because, I mean, just anecdotally, right? I grew up in a way that is no longer sustainable,
Yep.
right? The people I grew up with cannot live in the place we grew up anymore.
There's no replacement for that. Like,
Right.
and that is to a large extent, I think, wealth inequality. I mean, in New York, uh, I don't know what percentage of the apartments are basically just, safety deposit boxes for
Right.
extremely wealthy people. But this level of wealth inequality is problematic.
Here's the question for you, because I think that's right. We have a Democratic Party that is largely has a real problem with its populist base, right? Because if they didn't, Bernie Sanders would have been the nominee in
Yep.
2016. So, and even now, right, we see Chuck Schumer. I walked by his office the other day. There were 75 people outside very mad at him about this CR. So clearly, the party is not speaking to its activist base. They have not learned the lesson of 2024.
I mean, I don't know if it's just a question of speaking. Like, I mean, I know
Right.
you're using that in
No,
a broad sense,
represented. Right.
but I think, like, there is a problem where the only time that Barack Obama gets deeply involved in our politics is, last month of a campaign and basically, negotiating a way of boxing Sanders out
Right.
in that 2020 primary. And look, that's politics, but
But you want to win. I
but
mean,
you
politics is you want to
well,
win.
well, I don't know if that's always the case. I think there are people in the Democratic Party, interests in the Democratic Party, who would be more concerned with a Bernie Sanders than they would be with even, a perception of who Donald Trump was.
Yeah.
I just think that's the case. That's a problem. There is no figuring out. There is no learning of lessons. The people who want the Democratic Party to be more representative of working class people, middle class people, you can use it through the whatever lens you want, but not people who are millionaires. They need to take over the party. There is no learning lessons. I don't believe that there's going to be any lessons learned by these people. They're going to be either replaced or they're going to continue to do the same thing that keeps them in power. It's the iron law of institutions. Would I rather be head of a party that's out of power versus a not a head of a party that is in power? I think a lot of these people who aspire for these things want the power. And if they can expand on that power by being in the majority, they'll do it. If they can't, on some level, we saw it play out with never Trumpers. I mean, how do you justify being a never Trumper if you want to win? Donald Trump won. You know what I mean? It's like my part of this industry, my business in this industry hasn't won. This is a real dynamic. And I think from the perspective of people who want the party to move to the left, my message and my thought is stop waiting for people to learn lessons
Right.
and take over the party.
Find new people. Sam Seder, this is really fun.
Molly, it was great to talk to you.